China. The world's second largest economy with more than 1 billion people, a rapidly modernizing military, and the Belt and Road Initiative spreading its influence across the globe. It seems unstoppable, right? But despite all this, China faces deep challenges that make its strength more fragile than you might think. Today, we're diving into why China isn't quite as powerful as it appears. Let's start with the foundation of China's power, its economy. Over the past few decades, China has pulled off an economic miracle, growing at breakneck speed. But that growth is slowing down, and beneath the surface, cracks are starting to show. One of the biggest problems? Debt. China has racked up massive amounts of debt, over 280% of its GDP. Much of this debt is tied to local governments who've been borrowing heavily to fund infrastructure projects. You might have heard about China's infamous ghost cities, entire urban developments that are mostly empty. These are examples of risky investments that local governments have sunk money into, and now they're struggling to pay it back. According to estimates, local governments in China have amassed over $9 trillion in hidden debt. This kind of debt poses a huge risk to financial stability, and the central government is left to figure out how to manage this without triggering a crisis. China is also facing a demographic time bomb. For decades, the one-child policy, which was in place from 1979 to 2015, led to a massive drop in birth rates. Now, China's population is rapidly aging. By 2050, 1 in 3 people in China will be over the age of 60. What does this mean for the economy? Well, fewer young people in the workforce means slower growth. There will be more elderly citizens relying on social services and less tax revenue to support them. Even though China has tried to reverse this trend by allowing more children per family, it might be too little, too late. Now let's talk about politics. China's government is known for its tight grip on power, but under President Xi Jinping, that control has become even more centralized. Xi has consolidated power in a way we haven't seen since Mao Zedong, cracking down on dissent, jailing critics, and extending his presidency indefinitely. While this gives the appearance of stability, it's a double-edged sword. Centralized power means fewer checks and balances, less room for innovation, and a system where bad policies can go unchallenged. For example, look at China's COVID-0 policy. For years, the government pursued an incredibly strict approach to controlling the virus, but this led to massive economic slowdowns and public frustration. Social instability is also a growing problem. Despite the image of prosperity in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, China has deep inequalities. There's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and between urban and rural areas. The wealthier coastal regions have advanced rapidly, but inland provinces remain significantly poorer. This inequality is breeding resentment, particularly in rural areas where land seizures and low wages are common. Even in urban areas, strikes and labor protests have been on the rise. While the government has managed to keep a lid on major unrest, these tensions are simmering under the surface. China also faces enormous environmental challenges. It's the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and its rapid industrialization has come at a cost. Air pollution is a constant problem in cities, and water shortages are becoming more common. All of this creates public health risks and environmental degradation that could hurt China's long-term economic and social stability. To its credit, China is investing heavily in green energy. It's now the world's largest producer of solar panels. But there's still a long way to go before it can truly solve its environmental problems. So, while China might be able to throw money at problems and build impressive infrastructure, their lack of a truly innovative culture could come back to bite them in the long run. Because in the 21st century, the most powerful weapon isn't necessarily a tank or a missile, but a good idea. Now let's look at China's role on the world stage. While China has grown more assertive in recent years, particularly in the South China Sea and through the Belt and Road Initiative, this aggressive stance has actually started to backfire. In the South China Sea, China has been building artificial islands and claiming vast areas of ocean, but this has led to increasing tensions with neighboring countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. The United States and its allies have also ramped up their presence in the region, leading to a military standoff. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to build infrastructure and trade routes across Asia, Africa, and Europe, is another key part of its global strategy. But while it's expanded China's influence, it has also led to accusations of debt trap diplomacy. Many countries that have taken on Chinese loans to build these projects are now struggling to repay them. leading to pushback against China's influence. Despite its efforts to become more self-reliant, China is still heavily dependent on global trade. Much of its economy relies on exports to countries like the US and the European Union. Trade wars and sanctions, like the recent US restrictions on Chinese technology companies, have shown just how vulnerable China is to global market shifts. Now let's talk about technology. It's no secret that China has been making huge strides in this area, pouring billions into research and development and churning out engineers faster than you can say, made in China. But here's the thing. While China has become a tech giant in its own right, it still lags behind the US and other Western countries in several key areas. Think of it like this. China is like that friend who buys all the latest gadgets and gizmos, but can't quite figure out how to use all the features. They've got the fancy new phone, but they're still using it to make calls and send text messages. One of the biggest areas where China falls short is semiconductors. These tiny chips are the brains of modern electronics, powering everything from smartphones and laptops to fighter jets and satellites. And right now, China is heavily reliant on foreign suppliers for these crucial components. It's like trying to build a car without an engine. You can have the sleekest design and the most luxurious interior, but without that engine, you're not going anywhere. And it's not just semiconductors. China also lags behind in areas like advanced manufacturing, aerospace technology, and certain military technologies. They've been playing catch-up for years, but closing that gap is proving to be a lot harder than they thought. It's like trying to run a marathon when you're wearing lead shoes. You might be determined, but you're not going to win any races. So, while China has made impressive progress in technology, they're still playing second fiddle to the US in many crucial areas. And as technology becomes increasingly important in the 21st century, that gap could prove to be a major weakness for China. Now let's talk about China's military might. They've got the manpower, the hardware, and the swagger. They're like that guy at the gym who spends all day lifting weights and flexing in the mirror. But here's the thing about muscles. They don't mean much if you've never been in a fight. And that's the problem with China's military. They've been investing heavily in modernization, building new ships, planes, and missiles at a breakneck pace. But they lack one crucial ingredient: combat experience. The last time China's military was involved in a major conflict was the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. That's like a boxer who's spent years training in the gym but has never actually stepped into the ring. Now, some might argue that China's lack of combat experience is actually a strength. They haven't been bogged down in costly and protracted wars like the US has in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the reality is that modern warfare is incredibly complex. It's not just about having the biggest guns or the most soldiers. It's about strategy, logistics, coordination, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing situations. And these are all things that can only be learned through actual combat experience. It's like trying to learn how to swim by reading a book. You can memorize all the strokes and techniques, but until you jump in the water, you're not going to truly know how to swim. So while China's military might look impressive on paper, their lack of combat experience could prove to be a major liability if they ever find themselves in a real fight. Now, let's talk about soft power. You see, in today's world, true power isn't just about military might or economic clout. It's also about winning hearts and minds, about shaping global narratives, and about exporting your culture and values. Think Hollywood movies, American pop music, and those blue jeans that everyone around the world seems to love. And this is where China, despite its best efforts, still falls short. They've tried to export their culture through things like Confucius Institutes and state-sponsored media outlets. But let's be honest. Have you ever met anyone who's dying to get their hands on the latest Chinese pop song or blockbuster movie? The reality is that China's soft power remains relatively limited. Their strict censorship regime, their crackdown on dissent, and their tight control over cultural expression have made it difficult for Chinese artists, writers, and filmmakers to produce works that resonate with a global audience. It's like trying to throw a party with a strict no dancing, no loud music, and no fun allowed policy. People might show up out of obligation, but they're not going to have a good time. And this lack of soft power is a problem for China. In a world where perceptions matter, where narratives can shape opinions, and where culture can be a powerful tool of influence, China is still playing catch-up. They might be able to build the biggest buildings and the fastest trains, but they're still struggling to win over hearts and minds. So, while China might be a force to be reckoned with on the economic and military fronts, their lack of soft power remains a significant weakness. So, is China a paper dragon? While China is undoubtedly a major global player, it's not without its weaknesses. From its mountain of debt to its stifled innovation, from its aggressive foreign policy to its untested military, China faces a number of challenges that could hinder its rise to global dominance. Now, I'm not saying that China is going to collapse tomorrow or that it's all downhill from here, but it's important to look beyond the headlines and the impressive economic figures and recognize that China's rise is not inevitable. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next one.